Thank you so much, Vanessa. And what a magnificent event this has been. I must say, EAT really does set the gold standard for events all around the world now. It's just one of the highlights of the year to come here. So really big thank you to Gunhild and her team. And indeed, what a great message that just was from the Mayor of Stockholm, who's one of the leading members in the network that I represent, C40. And we're an organisation focused on climate change. And this week, we've produced a new analysis of the carbon emissions footprint of our cities. Instead of looking at the normal methodology of emissions that are produced within the city from the tailpipe of vehicles, from energy consumption, instead of looking at a consumption-based emissions analysis, looking right back down the supply chain of all the goods and services that are consumed within our cities. And one of the difficult messages that comes out of that whereas when we look at the conventional methodology, we've got a really good story, emissions are going down in our cities. When we start looking through the prism of consumption, they're going up, and going up quite rapidly. Indeed, emissions across these almost 100 big cities around the world will double by the middle of the century unless they're changed. And as you can see on the screen here, a really big gap now between where we need to be to stay within those relatively safe levels of a 1.5 degree maximum global average temperature rise and where we are heading. So what that analysis shows us is that emissions from consumption need to halve in just the next 10 years in these cities if globally we're able to stay within safe climate levels. And food is an absolutely critical element of those consumption patterns. And so what we've done with our research is taking the EAT-Lancet Commission's work, what constitutes a healthy, sustainable diet. We've taken that model and then looked at what it would mean if all of the citizens across C40 cities were eating a healthy, sustainable, a planetary healthy diet by 2030. And there's a lot of information on this graph, but just focus on the red bit that is the food. What that's told us is that actually, if we could introduce that healthy, sustainable diet across all C40 citizens, we could reduce emissions from food by 60% in the next 10 years in C40 cities. And as you can see, it's the second biggest of all of the categories of emissions that we look across when looking across cities. The others, sort of buildings and transport and clothing. So a really big opportunity of combining improved health with really significant contribution to tackling climate change. But there's some very difficult messages, as we've been discussing for the last 2 days in that. When one analyses what the change is that really needs to happen in carbon terms rather than in health terms, by far the most significant thing is reduction in meat and dairy consumption. And indeed, what our numbers show us is we need to move from an average of about 58 kilograms of meat consumed per person per year in C40 cities to 16 within the next 10 years. A similar shift in dairy consumption from 155 kilograms per person per year down to about 90. The interesting thing you'll see in the third statistic there, actually in terms of calorie intake, it pretty much stays the same in the model out to 2030, although there's a very different distribution. So a reduction in calories in many of the wealthier cities where there's big obesity problems, and an increase in calorie intake in many of our cities in the global south. So that dietary change is really what needs to happen to drive emissions down from food. There are some other important things: reducing household waste and avoiding supply chain waste. The picture, of course, is very different. We're across the world. We're talking about global averages here, and when one says these numbers, there's a look of horror in a lot of the members of our cities when we talk about a reduction from 58 kilograms to 16 kilograms per person of meat, when for them the main thing to do is to try and improve the calorie intake for many of their citizens who are going hungry. But as you can see on this graph, you can see the vast differences at the top end of the scale. North America, 25 portions of meat consumed on average per person, whereas at the other end of the scale, about 3 portions of meat per person in South Asia. That 3 portions is really where we need to get as an average by around 2030. So what kind of policies might get us there, and what's the role of city governments in achieving it? So starting perhaps at the end of the scale, away from that, the changing of the immediate dietary intake. Ending food waste, very important, something that cities have quite a bit of control over. We've seen in Milan a program to incentivize food recovery by providing tax rebates to retailers who donate their surplus food rather than throwing it away. In a very different part of the world, in Johannesburg, in South Africa, where the mayor is investing in urban agriculture, training thousands of farmers to grow sustainably within the city without using chemical pesticides or fertilizers. Or in my own home city, in London, where the mayor is really helping think about the messaging that goes out to Londoners about what food is good to eat, and so has banned junk food advertising across the whole of the transport system. One of the major areas that are used by food retailers to advertise their products. So now in, now in London, just as it's illegal to advertise cigarettes, it's now illegal to promote junk food on public transport. But then finally, perhaps the most important thing where mayors can really lead by example with their own procurement, we see in New York, where the mayor's introduced now Meatfree Mondays across all of the schools, so 1 million children now getting healthy diets with a little less meat, but also through the meat executive order promised to reduce by 50% the total amount of meat that the city purchases across the year. So a huge opportunity here around addressing healthy diets and how that can drive down emissions. And really, I think here is the big opportunity. You'll see the placard a young protester showed me at a demonstration in Oslo. You'll, old man, you'll die of old age, but I'll die of climate change. With addressing food here, I think we have a chance to turn that round and allow everybody to be part of the solution through the decisions that they make. So thanks again to everyone at EAT and enjoy the rest of the conference.